Well, good morning, everybody. And Mac, I am sure you peeked at my sermon notes. You didn't realize that in the prayer over the offering, but it's just funny how that works sometimes, you know. Well, I've gone casual today. I've never preached in track shoes and jeans before, but, you know, it's cold and snowy out, so I'm dressing for comfort today. And I don't have the pretty podium. I'm using the music stand, so we're going to kind of mellow out today. The title of the sermon today is The Spirit of Generosity, the Church of the Widow's Mite. Now, if I were to go around the room and ask you all, what are some of the most discussed topics of the New Testament? What would you say? Anybody? Some of the more prevalent things that we read about in the New Testament. How about love? Yeah. Salvation? Sin. What if I were to tell you that one of the most, and those are all good answers, but one of the most discussed topics, and people don't realize, is that of finances, money, giving. And it's brought up several times in the New Testament, and I think that was because it's important to us today. And I'm not going to talk about how much we should give. I mean, we've done that in the past. I'm not going to do that today because really, there's no set answer to that. That's up to the individual. There's no one size fits all. We all have different walks of life, finances. We're at different stages in life. So giving is an individual thing. And I'm not going to talk about good stewardship either because in the past, Pastor Ron has covered that very, very thoroughly, where we should be good stewards of not only our money, but all the other assets that God has so abundantly given to us. But rather today, I want to focus on the spirit of generosity. Is anybody here a people watcher? Oh yeah, Jerry's got his hand up. Oh yeah. Airports and Walmart, two of my favorites. Well, you know, Jesus was a people watcher as well. He stood back many, many times and observed people. And from his observations of everyday people like us, he taught the 12 disciples some very important lessons. Those lessons are recorded for us today. Why? Because as Christians, they are very, very important. In Luke 18, verse 9, we're going to hear about people that were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. And this was a lesson being taught to the disciples. And Jesus, as the way he taught a lot of times, taught this as a parable. And you know the story. 2 men went up to the church to pray. Who were they? Pharisee and a tax collector. Nobody likes tax collectors. They didn't then. They don't now. John, you mentioned the IRS. But tax collectors of that day were a little bit different than tax collectors today. I mean, they did the same function, but tax collectors of Christ's time were known to be corrupt. Because how did they collect taxes in that time? They didn't have checks. They didn't have credit cards. How did they collect the taxes? Door to door, but in what form? Coins, yes. Cash money. And we all know cash is easy to evaporate. And the tax collectors at that time had the reputation of being corrupt and skimming off the top some of the cash that was supposed to go to the government. So there was 2 reasons people didn't like them. One, their hard-earned money was going to a Roman government that they didn't really like. And 2, these tax collectors were getting rich by skimming. So there was probably no worse respected profession than that of the tax collector. So we see the Pharisee, and the Pharisee was who? A respected man, a religious leader, probably wealthy in his own right. And they both go into the temple and pray. The Pharisee stood up and he prayed about what? Himself. Excellent. Yes, he prayed about himself. And when he prayed, I expect he did it loudly so everybody could hear. God, I want to thank you that I am not like other men. I am superior. The Dos Equis man, the most interesting man ever. That's what he thought of himself. I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this point the finger tax collector, read jerk, thief, anything you want to insert there. The Pharisee was so thankful he wasn't like the tax collector. I fast twice a week, extra points, and give a tenth of all I've got. I mean, these guys, they tithe down to bottles of spices. Not just money, I mean everything, and they were so careful. And in their rituals, in their routines, that reinforced to them how righteous and godly they were, unlike the tax collector. Now, Scripture doesn't say this, but I have heard it conjectured as to the identity of the tax collector. Any guesses as to who that might have been by name? No. Little guy in a tree. Yeah. Remember his name, the little guy? Zacchaeus, yes. The little guy, that he was such a short little fella, he wanted to see Christ go by, and he couldn't see above the crowds, so he climbs a tree, sitting there on the limb. He was a tax collector, and how did Christ surprise everybody? He rode into town, and who did he want to go see? Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And we know the story of Zacchaeus. And some wonder, was the tax collector of this parable Zacchaeus? I don't know. Could have been, but it's fun to think about. So who was the Pharisee trying to impress? God? Probably so. Anybody that could hear him? Check. He certainly was impressed with himself, so he should share that with others. He gave a tenth of everything. His physical, worldly goods. But what can you say about the man's heart? What can you say? Verse 13, it says, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said in prayer, God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. He did not even mention money. He did not mention greatness. He did not mention all the good things he did, but showed a humble spirit. And Jesus said, that man, not the Pharisee, that man, please God. In Luke 20:46, Jesus said to the disciples, another lesson, beware of the teachers of the law. Who are the teachers of the law? The Pharisees, for one, yeah. He says, beware. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats at the UK basketball games. I'm sorry, you didn't say that. I made that up. The most important seats in the synagogues, the churches. They wanted to be seated where everybody could see them. And they wanted to be at places of honor, at the banquets, the head of the table, by the host. But he also said they devour widows' houses. What does that mean? They devour widows' houses. Are widows generally rich people? Generally not. And that time, if a woman lost her husband, she lost her main source of what? Income. Support, that's right. And a lot of them lost their houses to men like the Pharisees. And for a show, Jesus said, for a show, or we might say as a cover-up, they make lengthy prayers for show. Continuing on in the next chapter, which is Luke 21, Jesus is again people watching. Luke 21:1, it says, as he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. So I kind of imagine him, along a wall someplace or standing afar off so people wouldn't know that he was watching them. He stood there, curious about what the people were going to do. Now, the treasury at that time at the temple was in a place called the Court of Women. The Court of Women was called that because it was one of the places in the temple where the women were allowed to go. They may have been restricted from other parts of the temple, but they were welcome there because their money was as welcome as the men's. And that's where they kept the treasury. Now, the treasury consisted of 13 collection boxes that were shaped like inverted megaphones or trumpets, with the bell like this. And they were made out of metal. Now, what form we're talking about, they had cash at that time. What form did the cash take? Coins, yes. Various coins in a metal box. Now, if you worked it just right and did it enough, when you put your offering in the box, in the metal box, not like we have the little soft baskets. We don't have the big metal boxes. But if you worked it right, when you threw your coins in, you could make them zing and hit. Like a slot machine. You've heard that. So if you had a big handful of coins, you could make some noise. And people would hear that. And why did they do that? To be impressive. To be impressive. And as Jesus stood there in verse 2, it continues, he says he also saw a poor widow put into very small copper coins. Copper coins. They had coins made of copper, and they had coins made of silver, and they had coins made of what? Gold. And we all know the gold ones were the best, like the gold medal. Silver was second, and then there was the lowly copper. I tell you the truth, he said. Jesus continued, I am telling you the truth. Bottom line, this is the way it is. He said, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. That impressed Jesus, the Christ. God come down. The quiet little widow with 2 copper coins impressed him more than the big show from the people that gave from their wealth. So what was the point here? What is he trying to say? People, give till it hurts? Put every last dime in that you've got? Not at all. That is not the point Jesus is trying to make. Because remember, Pastor said, we are to be what? Careful stewards of our money. In his sermons and Bible studies, he said, use what? Wisdom. So Christ isn't encouraging people to give till it hurts, but he was impressed with what? Her spirit of generosity. The poor widow. It talks about teachers devouring the widow's house. You just kind of wonder if the person before her, someone that gave the big offering, could have been somebody that had taken her house. You know, it doesn't say that specifically, but you just kind of wonder. I do. And we've talked about that story many, many times, haven't we? The widow's mite. We know it well. But that story came home to me a couple of years ago. And I've talked about this before. In an email that I received from an organization a couple years ago, they thanked us for a small offering that our church gave. And I realized the story we just read applies to what? Churches as well as individuals. Now, I'm going to make a profound statement here. It's going to blow you away. Our church isn't as big as it used to be. Yeah, I know, you're surprised. And there was a time when we had a lot of money in the bank and investments. And we donated thousands, I'm serious, we have donated thousands of dollars, both within our denomination and outside. And that is not a bad thing. We helped out our own congregations that had been through terrible storms. And we donated a lot of money for Bibles that they might go to countries that had never heard the gospel. But at that time, we donated from our richness because we had a lot of money. A couple of years ago, a letter came into the office over here. And it explained that the Lexington firefighters wanted to revive their chaplaincy program to help with the spiritual needs of Lexington's firefighters, who go through a lot of stress individually in their job, just like the police and some of the others. And someone saw a need to revive a program that had kind of died out. Well, it had died out. And this person wanted to revive the program to help the firefighters. And they sent the letters to all the churches in Lexington. Everybody got a letter asking for donations to help them get up and going again. And our board of directors met, and we approved a whopping $100 to help them out. And we also offered, if they needed it, the use of our building. If they didn't have a place to go, just like we offered the use of our building to the Spanish church. And I sent an email to their chaplain, and I started with an apology. I said, I am sorry, we can only donate $100. We are a small church, and we do not have a lot. And that is the same time, if you remember, the would-be copper thieves whacked our air conditioning to try to steal our copper. And we were looking at a big repair bill. And I apologized, and I said, I am sorry. We can only give $100. And I got an email back from him. He emailed back and he said, do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? He said, you are the Church of the Widow's Mite. When we had a lot of money, we gave out of riches. Now we are small, we give from the heart. And the chaplain realized that. Like the widow with her 2 small copper coins. And where does that take us? What is the reward when we have an attitude like the widow? Our reward is here as well as later. Paul spoke to the Galatians, and in Galatians 5:22, there's a special verse, and we have talked about it many, many times. Any guesses? The fruits of what? The Spirit. That's right, Mac. The fruits of the Spirit. It says, but the fruit of the Spirit is what? Love, joy, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. And where does generosity fit in? It supports all these fruits. How can you talk about love and not talk about generosity? How can you talk about a peaceful spirit within yourself if you don't have generosity? How can you talk about kindness and goodness and faithfulness and thankfulness if we don't also have a spirit of generosity? Paul continues and he says, against these things there is no law. He says when you have these things, you have got a good life. And people, I am here to tell you all, I know we have a good life. We have a most excellent life. But what happens when we start to live God's way? He brings gifts into our lives. And gifts do not have to be physical. I saw something posted on Facebook. I think I might have mentioned this before, but it was at Christmas time, and somebody wrote, as you get older, the things on your wish list for Christmas are not physical. And the list is much shorter. He brings gifts into our lives, much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Who grew up in the country? Yeah, okay. Or have ever been to the country? Or know what the country is, like farms and stuff, and orchards and trees? But an orchard, when the fruit starts out, it doesn't pop up an apple or a pear or grapes, whatever. It starts as what? Flower, a little tiny bloom. We had an orchard when I grew up, cherries and apples and different things. And I would stand there under that tree looking up like, okay, Mom is telling me that flower there is going to be an apple someday. Okay, Mom. But as I watched, the flower that was so pretty at first withered away, and then a little tiny bump of a fruit would appear. You know what I'm talking about. I see the heads nod, yeah. And that little bump would get bigger and bigger, and then it would turn green, and then it would get bigger, and then it would turn red, and then it would fall off the tree. And we'd gather them up and take them home to Mom, because that was just so cool. But it didn't happen overnight. It didn't. He brings gifts into our lives much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Those gifts develop. They enrich and they grow, just like the cherry or the apple. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. A conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. What does that mean? I mean, it sounds good, but What does that mean? That we see God's hands work. We see his hand work in our lives, in others' lives. And we're all on different roads. We're on the different roads together, you might say. And maybe somebody isn't convicted of the Spirit. Not yet. Not yet. But we know that it's just a matter of time. People get into arguments about religion and race and, you name it. But I just kind of think God's going to sort it all out. That's not our job. It's not our job. But to the faithful, God gives gifts, the fruits of the Spirit, and generosity is one of those. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life like the Pharisee that bragged about himself so much. We don't have to do that. We have an inner peace that the Pharisee lacked, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. I want to thank everybody for coming out on this cold day, although I think it's supposed to get up to a balmy 46 degrees. And I thank you to come to listen to this message. It's simple, but it's true. And I see people nodding and smiling, so I take that as a good thing. So I will close service today, and the saints of God said, Amen.